Hey, I bet you thought you were going to be listening to the Anti-Social podcast.
But we're taking over for the next 30 seconds. It's Broden and Cody Flow State podcast. Where can you check it out?
You can check it out everywhere, all the podcast platforms, YouTube and Facebook as well.
That's right. And weekly we'll be talking about anything we can with whoever we can for as long as we possibly can get away with. It's a great time.
On our podcast, we chat to UFC fighters, elite athletes, comedians, whoever.
Anybody who's got a great story to tell, and that could be you, so maybe you'll end up on our podcast one day. You got to check it out, the Broden and Cody Flow State podcast, available everywhere you can find a podcast. Now, back to Andy's show. Thanks, Andy.
Hey, it's the Anti-Social Podcast, and before we kick into this week's episode, come over and join me on Patreon. That's right, patreon.com/Andy Dowling is the place to go to support this little old podcast of mine, and support starts from only $1 a month, dirt cheap, little feel-good payment, and there are additional tiers to support the podcast, and you get exclusive little goodies, including podcast episodes for Patreon only, where I waffle on and talk about a whole bunch of different things, lots of silly stuff, including a segment called James and Planes, which features James Norbert giving me recommendations for different planes to talk about, of all things. But lots of dumb and fun things that I do over at Patreon. But more importantly, the support that you guys give via Patreon keeps the Anti-Social Podcast fueled, and I have lots of grand plans for the future, and it all comes from my Patreon community. So thank you very much to you guys, and get over to patreon.com/Andy Dowling and join the fun. And it's another episode of the Anti-Social Podcast, episode 232. We have a return guest on the potty. It is Ryan Quarrington from Shatter, Alkira, Paraphernalia Wagon, The Kraken, a whole bunch of great Adelaide metal bands. Ryan was on the podcast on episode 227, and this is part 2 of that chat, and we had an epic long chat, and I split this into 2 very distinctive sections. Part 1 was all about music. We talked about Shatterbrain's latest album, Pitchfork Justice, which you can grab right now from shatterbrainmetal.com. And we just talked about metal and Ryan's early sort of musical beginnings and getting into metal, and lots of music talk. But part 2 goes in a different direction, and what a lot of you people don't know, is that Ryan is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Adelaide Spinal Research Group and Centre for Orthopaedic and Trauma Research at the University of Adelaide. Fuck, that's a mouthful. Amazing stuff that Ryan does, and Ryan will be able to talk about this far better than I can in this intro, but let me attempt to butcher it. But Ryan, more or less, in a very sort of poor way of describing it, obtains people's bodies that have been donated, and puts these bodies, more so the torso, through different types of trauma to research how the spine reacts to trauma, and understands why spines break or dislocate or whatever it might be, and in the hope that they can find ways to support and take care of people that have received spinal injuries, etc. I'll let Ryan explain it far better than me, but amazing work. Ryan's got some killer stories. You're going to really get a kick out of this. And I've mentioned this before in the past, but this is an example of the type of podcast that I love doing. I've got so many mates and people that I've played with over the years in the metal world, musicians, and it's great to talk about music. It's great to talk about metal, but it's even better to talk about stuff that is completely unexpected, because a lot of these guys you only get to interact with in the musical space, but to be able to talk and discover what people do outside of music is just really, really fascinating. And this is one of the best examples out there of somebody that's just doing something so incredibly cool and interesting. So really hope you enjoy this one. Go and support Shatterbrain's brand new album, Pitchfork Justice, over at shatterbrainmetal.com. Shatterbrain's on all the socials, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, blah, blah, blah. I'll put all the links in the show notes, as well as Ryan's social media handles. I'll put some links to Ryan's work that he does as well, that's talked about in this chat, over in the show notes over at andydowling.net or andysocial.net. But that's it. let's kick into this episode with Ryan Quarrington. And explain basically what the hell a biomedical engineer is and what do you actually do?
Well, so I work for a research organisation called the Adelaide Spinal Research Group. It's a part of the Adelaide Medical School at the University of Adelaide. And I guess that the main, I've got a lot of different projects now because I'm a postdoc at the moment, so I'm kind of across everything that our group does. But my main area of research is cervical spine or neck trauma. So my PhD was on trying to understand neck dislocation, we call cervical spine facet dislocation. So essentially when people dive into a shallow pool or don't wear their seatbelt properly, or even if they do wear their seatbelt properly and it's a particularly bad car accident, when they get paralysed, more often, well, about 50% of the time they've had a thing called this neck dislocation injury, which is where you actually have, as the name suggests, a dislocation of the neck. So you have two vertebrae dislocate, and then your spinal cord, which passes through your neck and that carries all the signals from your brain to the rest of your body, gets squashed, and then you become paraplegic and you're just floating in the water and your friends come in and grab you. Trying to understand why that actually happens. So it's not a very frequent injury. It happens in about 2% of all trauma cases, but when it does occur, you're pretty much guaranteed to have a neurological injury and end up in a wheelchair. So it's a pretty serious kind of injury. But we don't really know exactly what causes it. We know the causation, so what kind of things are associated with it, but we don't know exactly what's happening to the head and the spine and the rest of the body when the bones actually dislocate. So my PhD was basically aimed at better understanding that. So the first part of it was I did an audit of cases at our local hospital and did some statistical analysis to try and correlate features of the injury and features of the patient cohort with their neurological outcome. And then the second part of it was working with cadaver spines in materials testing machines, which is where the engineering part of it comes in, to actually try and create the injury and see what kind of forces and loading directions would cause the spine to move such that dislocation occurred. So that's my main area of research, really.
So, all right. So to interpret it in an Andy way, that last part you said, you're basically getting donations from people that have been deceased, and putting those parts through trauma to try and replicate some of these things that have happened. So, like a healthy specimen, but putting that through a degree of trauma or some sort of scenario that would put it through a similar trauma that would increase the likelihood of a similar situation occurring.
Exactly right, yeah. So we take healthy cadaver material,
yeah.
I dissect it down, and then I manipulate it so that I can apply controlled conditions to it, so controlled forces or impacts or displacements or whatever it might be, to try and create the injury. And I try and replicate what might be happening in a real life scenario as best as possible. And then I basically instrument the shit out of the specimen. So I put lots of strain gauges on there, so things that measure how much the bone is deflecting. Lots of like 3D motion capture, so putting essentially photoreflective markers on each. So our spine has 7 vertebrae or 8 vertebrae, depending how you characterize it. And I put little photoreflective markers on each one so that I can record that while I'm doing the injury or trying to create the injury, and see how each little vertebra is moving relative to the next. And that can help us to inform what's happening during a real life scenario, with the ultimate goal of just trying to better understand how we can stop those exact combinations of forces and displacements happening to the head or the spine, and prevent these injuries from happening.
Just so I can get a bit of a visual, or anybody that's listening get a visual, when you say like parts of a cadaver, is it like to what extent are you getting right down to a very small cross section of vertebrae or anything like that, or have you got like a torso, or like to what extent are you actually like, what is it? What are you actually dealing with? What's the tangible?
So it depends on the research question or the project, really. So my PhD, I dealt with what we call functional spinal units. So that's essentially two vertebrae, which are the bones in your neck, and all the joints that go between those. And so I was dealing with those at a very sort of fundamental level, trying to just apply very controlled motions to that one joint and see how I can dislocate it. And that essentially took my entire PhD, just doing that part of it, with all the measurements that went around it. But then now my postdoc, so we got a federal grant based on my PhD work to continue the work, and that's what I get paid out of now. And I've moved from these isolated units to full necks. So essentially what we get in typically are head necks so essentially when someone donates their body, they just get a big bandsaw and they cut it up and divide it off into whoever wants to purchase the individual parts. And we ask for mostly the whole spine, but if we can't, just the neck and the head. And then I get those, and then I have to go in and dissect those down to whichever parts I want. So at the moment, I'm taking off the heads, and I just use the cervical spine or the neck. And then I'm putting that into a contraption I've designed, which is called a drop tower, which is it's essentially a weighted carriage that I drop onto the specimen, and I have the specimen configured to try and replicate what would happen in this kind of scenario during a car crash or someone diving into a shallow pool or whatever. And then I measure what happens and see if I've created the injury.
Fuck. I probably should have brought this up at the beginning of the conversation. Fucking hell, this is like it's fucking mental. I mean, in like a really interesting, intense way. But I mean, all right. Hang on. Let me work out which way to go with this. So have like going through all of your study and obviously this has been years of you sort of studying and getting up to where you are now, is where what you're doing now as far as working with specimens and things like that. I mean, obviously it comes with the territory. It is what it is. But has this been a big learning curve for you, or a big sort of environmental sort of adjustment for you to sort of get used to dealing with this sort of stuff? Because if you everyday drop kick, most people never get to see, well, I shouldn't say never get to see, they never see a deceased person for the most part, let alone sort of in a very full frontal, I would assume very intense sort of position, even if it is sawed up, it's still a piece of person, so I mean, how's that been for you?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, not to give you my life story, but when I first came into uni, I was like a very sporty kid, despite what appearances would suggest now. And I was good at school. So when I was sort of looking at unis and what I wanted to get into, there was this course at University of Adelaide called sports engineering. And I was like, oh, that combines the best of both worlds. I'll just go and do that. But then I kind of realized that, I thought I was going to end up working for Nike and designing boots and make millions of dollars or whatever. But then I kind of realized that it wasn't really what I wanted So I kind of got more into the engineering side of things. And then my supervisor now, she came and spoke when I was in third year or second year or something like that about what she did, which is essentially what I do now. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. So I went and did honours and PhD and whatnot with her. So it was definitely not what I sort of started out thinking I was going to do, and then all of a sudden you're just at a point where you're in a morgue or you're in an anatomy laboratory, and there's bodies in front of you and you're cutting them up. So it's the first time it was a bit of a shock, but you start to kind of just realize what humans are made up of. We're just meat and bones and nerves and electrical processes, really. So it's a bit of a, like you said, a bit of a learning curve, but you get over that pretty quickly, and you start to really see the value in what you're doing and how important it is.
I remember there's somebody I had in the podcast years ago, Emma Jane Holmes, I think, and she's She works at a funeral home, and she was doing like blog posts or whatever to try and, I guess, not glamorize what she was doing, but just to try and, I guess,
normalize it.
Yeah, a little bit, and just put a bit of I guess, not so much of a comedic spin against it, but just try and lighten it a little bit and understand like everyone's going to die at some point. So here's my experiences, and just try and take away some of the darkness away from it, or the fear that's away from, that people associate with death. And like she would be sort of assisting with prepping bodies for open casket, or just when, or collecting bodies from people's homes when they died, or whatever it might be. And the way that from what I can recall, because it's been a while since I even remember that conversation, but she got this sense of detachment from it, where she still sort of had some sort of I guess awareness of what was going on around her, but really, as you just said, we're all we're made up of meat and flesh and veins and bones and things, and it is what it is, like, and just became sort of this objective, very factual sort of thing that was in front, where it's like, well, I've got a job to do, whatever that job may be. And it's not so much about, getting swept up in all those stigmas that are attached to death and deceased bodies and things like that. It's just like, well, this is my purpose, this is my function, this is what I need to do in this step, in this process, and I'm going to get in there and do what I need to do. And it's such a foreign thing for most people, because most people just would never experience anything near it.
Yeah, I think I was lucky as well. Like, my supervisor was really good. I started my honours research project. I was an animal project, so I won't go into the details, but essentially I was working with animal material. But she taught me to give that material the same respect that I'd give to a human cadaver. So the transition really wasn't that, apart from seeing your first head and that kind of thing. But actually, like, seeing heads isn't the most striking, or like what's the word, shocking, I guess, thing, because you don't really look at your own head that much, or heads in general that much. Like, and when you see them, after they're deceased, they just look like props, really. But it's when you see things like hands and feet, like, because you see your hands and your feet and the palms of your hands every day, and that's actually a lot more confronting, I find, than heads, because it's like, holy, that was someone, lifted a cup of tea however many thousands of times with that thing during their life. So, but you're just taught to be respectful, and it just becomes, it's a job. It becomes part of your job, and you're not looking at the minute thing that you're doing in that instance, where you might have your fingers up someone's spinal canal trying to dissect it away from the rest of the body. You're just focusing on, the end goal, and being respectful while you do it. So it's just a state of mind, I think.
Yeah, man. Oh, it's fucking crazy. I mean, just from, I guess, I mean, for you, it's been your journey and what you do, and it's everyday normal practice as far as what you've studied and what you've got to now. But I guess for most people out there, it's such a weird and unusual thing that most people would never be even close to experiencing. So it's interesting. But even for you, just to sort of compare sort of hands and feet compared to like someone's head, like for me, like, and I think just, you think about your classic horror movies and things like that, you always associate the head as the scary part, the part that would shock you. But that kind of makes a bit of sense, where you sort of look at your hands, because you, apart from looking at yourself in the mirror, your hands are in front of you, and sort of what impact hands have in everything. Whereas, I guess you're not picking up things with your mouth as much.
Yeah. Well, I think the whole horror movie thing maybe has desensitized, at least me, to it a little bit. Like, because you see it and you're like, it just looks like a prop, like it just looks like that thing in the movie that, isn't real. But it's like, when you see a hand with, nails and hair and that kind of thing, and, especially the faces that most donors are elderly people. So I don't know how to say this politically, but it's like,
do you want me to say it for
their
you?
their time had come.
Yeah.
Whereas, hands, it could be a 40-year-old person, it could be an 80-year-old person. So, well, it shouldn't matter, but there's a more. I find there's a more human element to those kind of things than there is the face.
Mm. Well, I think, and I assume that sort of just knowing what you're doing sort of gives you an overarching sort of purpose, which gives you peace of mind that would then help desensitize what you do. Like, it's sort of like, there's a method to the madness. It's not just being exposed to trauma in general. It's just a case of, there is a purpose here. I'm here to do something in particular, and there's an end goal, or there's an objective that I'm trying to reach. And so I can sort of place things into particular categories or into particular things to look at it from a particular angle, so I can interpret it in a way that sort of I can digest it and live with it, as opposed to somebody that probably would see maybe somebody's hacked up body, but in a completely different environment. It might be a different story.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of regulation. We have to go through stringent ethics protocols before we do anything. So we have very strict protocols around how we conduct ourselves and who can see what we're doing and all that kind of stuff. And these people have donated their body to science. They know what they're getting themselves into. And I've elected to donate my own body to science, but my only condition is that I'm part of an actual study. I'm not a pilot test or a methods development kind of specimen, because I want to make sure that my results from my tests are actually in a publication or something important, not just some PhD student's journey along the way. So,
do you mean like, as far as just is it more of a case of, people might donate their bodies that become sort of something that's in sort of early stage sort of student learning, and then that gets, I can't think of a better way of describing it, but just thrown in the trash after it's been used.
I mean, you can't actually request that, but I do think about the people who've donated their bodies to science, and I've had to tell some student that they fucked up and that basically that specimen's useless, and so now it's not going to be part of the final study. But a useful lesson was learned. That person who donated their body has contributed to this person's learning, and that person might go on to win a Nobel Prize. So who knows?
It's all part of the process, isn't it? I mean, you need them at every stage of the way. Yeah. Did you make that sort of call yourself as far as donating, making the decision to donate your body? Was that sort of something that came when you were in the thick of it yourself, and sort of looked back and went, actually, I should do this myself? Yeah,
I mean, I didn't really know about it until I started doing this work. But I had elected to be an organ donor, but I took the next step and decided to donate my body to science after I became aware of the process and this work and that kind of thing, and seeing how important it is. So yeah, I mean, it's not for everyone. It's you're not going to have a proper, you're not going to have an open casket, and you're pretty much resigning yourself, if that's the right word, to be cremated and that kind of thing. So there are some of those considerations to make, but the amount of good things that potentially can come out of it, I think, outweighs all of that.
Do you have any idea, sort of, not so much statistics, but are there a lot of people that sort of go down this path as far as making those calls themselves to donate, or is it sort of a minority sort of percentage?
It depends where you're looking. In Australia, it's not so common. I don't know the statistics, but we get most of our material from overseas, from the States in particular, because there are, I don't know the full legalities and how the operations work, but I think a lot of the material we get is from homeless or disconnected people. So there's that kind of aspect to it as well. And obviously there's a much larger population, and there's only certain people who need this kind of material. So it makes most economic sense for us to get it from the States primarily.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see, because I know that, I've spoken to people in the past and they talk about, being an organ donor or donating yourself to science, etc. And I don't know. I don't know if there's a correlation between sort of countries that are probably a little bit more religious and those countries sort of not electing for those to do that sort of thing versus more secular populations who probably would be more open to giving that option to people to allow people to do what they need to with your body.
Yeah, we had a Sri Lankan research engineer working with us for a while, and he was Buddhist, and I'm not sure if this is across all Buddhist practice, but he was like, nah, there's no way I can donate my body to science. It's like I have karma phala, whatever they call it, and it's like I have other regenerations of my lifestyle, and so my body needs to be appropriately managed after I pass on, that kind of thing. So yeah, you get it, which for us is a little disadvantageous because there's a bias in the specimens that we can work with. But I think people are all people in the end. And there's other things you can use to screen for particular traits you want in a subject. So it all comes out in the wash in the end, I think.
Yeah, I guess under the skin, and depending on the research that you're doing, but under the skin, probably very similar mechanics that are going on underneath the hood. Especially, I assume for the type of work that you're doing, it would be. You wouldn't be sort of wouldn't be too varied as far as the type of people. But would you see your research as far as age would be a big factor? Or
Yeah. So what I saw, and it wasn't really a groundbreaking kind of discovery, but in the particular injury that I was interested in my PhD, when I did the audit of cases at the local hospital, there was a bimodal distribution in age. So we had young people who were doing stupid things, and then we had elderly people who were falling over and knocking their head and getting this injury. And that's very common of all sort of neck injuries. That's the similar kind of distribution that we see. But another big one is smoking, and also people who've suffered from cancer. So anyone who's had any kind of chemotherapy or whatever, it's obviously affects your bone quality, and so those things come into the likelihood of having a bone fracture and that kind of thing. So we have to screen for people who've had any sort of radiotherapy or whatever, or long-term smoking, even drinking as well, bad for bone quality. So I'm probably going to be a shit specimen, but those kind of things come into it as well that we have to be conscious and mindful of. But you need that spread to represent the entire population. So because most of our specimens that we get are elderly, because we get them from donation programs, we can just justify our research by saying, well, that's a big population that gets this kind of injury, so we're targeting it at those people. And if a few 30 to 40-year-old cadavers come our way, then we can look at those as well.
Is there, from what I can recall, what you said earlier, like you guys are it's still an unknown overall, but do you have any sort of hunches as far as what potentially is going on? Because I don't know, from a dumb shit's point of view, and I put my hand up over here, when someone goes through that sort of trauma, I'm assuming that here we go. There's going to be a bunch of all sorts of I'm just going to call it wiring that probably gets crimped or compromised, that sort of affects the signals that are coming through to the brain, and then obviously that shuts down a lot of the commands that are going to the rest of the body. But I don't, obviously, it's not that simple. But what are the hunches that you have so far after doing it for so long?
Well, I guess the big, so we really come at it from the mechanics side of things. And so the mechanism of the actual neurological injury itself is relatively well understood, not entirely, but relatively well understood. But actually, how the dislocation occurs is what we're really interested in.
Right.
So,
okay.
Traditionally, there was a few papers in the 60s. Actually, I've got a great story for you, so please remind me if I forget to tell it.
All right,
but
write it
down. Particularly in the 60s, there was these researchers who theorized that the way to create a neck dislocation injury was due to hyperflexion. So flexion is where you nod your head towards your chest, but the issue with that is that your chin touches your chest, and you can do that right now if you like, and you can do it as hard.
I'm actually doing it right now. Yeah,
you can do it as hard as you want, and you're not going to dislocate your neck.
Okay.
But they kind of proposed that they called this injury a hyperflexion injury or a distractive flexion injury, and then clinicians have just run with it for nearly 60 years, and they've just kind of said, yeah, that's what happens. And there's a lot of other kind of like particular ligaments that fail that kind of support that a little bit, because the ligaments to the back of your neck fail, which suggests, oh yeah, no, if you're stretching forwards and you stretch too far, then those will break. But you can't physically do it. You can't physically dislocate a neck by just pushing the head down towards the chest. And actually, I'll tell the story now. This researcher from Adelaide, Robert Bors or Bob Bors, he went over to Oxford for a postdoc or fellowship or whatever surgeons do in the early 70s. And he started doing some research, and he found that, in fact, so he got a bunch of cadaver necks, and he did like 13 of them. And he found that, well, if you hold the head upright and you have the torso fixed, and then you start squashing, the neck starts to actually buckle, and then you'll start to see these motions happening in the lower part of the spine, which is where we see most of these neck dislocation cases that result in a dislocation. And he was able to produce for the first time these dislocation injuries in an experimental situation in like 6 of 12 or 6 of 14 cadavers in a really crude and rudimentary kind of setup, which is pretty amazing. And that research kind of went unnoticed, and then I was giving and I'd referenced him a bunch of times, and there was a few fundamental flaws in his research, so I'd probably naively dismissed his results and his experiments a little bit. Anyway, I'd finished my PhD, and I was going to give this wrap-up presentation at one of our little local meetings at the hospital to just a bunch of surgeons, and I got this email from this Robert Bors, and I was like, name sounds familiar. And he sort of explained who he was, and I was like, oh, holy shit, I've been referencing you for like the last 5 or 6 years, blah, blah, blah. He's like, yeah, I've got, he was doing this, when he was doing that work at Oxford, he was working with this engineer that went on to be the team leader that developed the first MRI machine, and also started a company called Vicon, which is now the world leader in motion capture.
Wow.
So really smart guy. And so they had like one of the first cine radiograph setups. So it was like 4 X-rays per second, taking photos of the X-rays as they were doing what they were doing. And so he had all this amazing legacy material that no one else has ever seen. The paper that they published that I've been referencing, it was full of like flaws and things they hadn't analysed or whatever. But he basically came to my lab and he was like, here's a box of materials from the 70s. Do whatever you want with it. And I was like, oh, wow, that's amazing. I'll get heaps out of that. And then he starts telling me about how he just stole the necks that he used from the morgue, like from the anatomy lab at Oxford University, how he didn't know what he was going to do with them when he came back to Australia. So he boiled them down to just the bony parts and brought them in his checked luggage back to Australia in the 70s. And then at one point he decided it was probably a bad idea to have those in his house, so he buried them in his backyard in his old his old house. So there's some house somewhere in Adelaide that has 14 necks just buried in their backyard.
And I mean, no offense, but I mean, South Australia does have a bit of a reputation for some dodgy dealings over the years. Wow. We
put Snowtown on the map, so now Adelaide's turn. But
oh wow!
But anyway, so that was pretty amazing. But what he showed then is in what Bob showed then in the 70s is basically what we think is the case now. It hasn't really been shown, but essentially there was a bit of research in the 90s, but it still hasn't been conclusively proven. But what we think is that it's not this sort of nodding force or motion or whatever. It's a compression of the head, which causes this buckling of the neck. Like if you've got a piece of spaghetti and you push from both ends, like wet spaghetti, you push from both ends, it'll kind of buckle. Same thing happens with the neck, and that causes these motions to occur in the lower neck, which then results in this dislocation injury.
Did you sorry, really quickly, have you ever seen I can't remember the show, but do you remember the character Milo Kerrigan? Which I remember the name. Yeah, Sean McAuliffe. He had a character on not the Late Show, but maybe Full Frontal or whatever, Milo Kerrigan. And so he'd wear like a neck brace or whatever, but he'd have his head really squashed into his shoulders. Yeah. So basically, like his whole neck is being pushed down into his shoulders. So when you're mentioning that, I'm imagining Milo Kerrigan just basically pushing his whole head down with triple chin happening right down smack bang into the middle of his shoulders. So
well, that's exactly right. That's exactly what.
All right. So
and we think that when that happens, really, we think that when the Milo Kerrigan effect happens really quickly, that it causes these dislocations to occur, and so we're trying to evaluate that.
Oh, fuck. How can I make a T-shirt out of this? All right, I'm gonna write this down.
My next paper is gonna be the Milo Kerrigan effect.
So good. I'll have to find a photo. Oh fuck. All right. Okay. Oh man. Oh, that's it. That's incredible. I mean, I'm just picturing this guy. I mean, he's just to try and recall what you said. He's more or less had this research paper that had a lot of flaws in it. He's done all this extra research, but for whatever reason, that hasn't been publicized or hasn't been validated or whatever it might be. And then it's been sitting there collecting dust, not doing anything. And he's found out about you. So he's paying attention to obviously what's happening in the world, like in Adelaide and the research and things like that. And he's reached out to you and obviously seen what you're doing and agreed with, you know, what work you're doing and what you're putting together, and supplied you with all this extra material to say, here, hopefully this can help you kind of accelerate what you're already doing. Yep. But that gap in time is decades. So he's obviously gone off and done whatever else in his life, and left all this stuff sit there, and probably not because of his own doing as such, but just because of circumstance.
Well, I think essentially it was a condition or a recommendation of part of his fellowship at Oxford, which is a very research-intensive institution, to be like, go do some research. Yeah. And for whatever reason, he hooked up with this super brilliant engineer, and they formulated this experiment, and they did it, and it kind of just, like, people were aware of it, but just kind of hadn't put the different pieces together because I think of the flaws. So one of the flaws was that to hold the bottom of the specimen. So when you're dealing with these kind of specimens, one of the issues is how do you grip onto them, because you've got to keep them wet, you've got to keep them hydrated, because that's it's like in the body.
Yep.
Yeah. But then how do you hold on to them to be able to manipulate them in a controlled environment? And so his answer was to stick a pole up the spinal canal, and he just stuck it up to some random point, and then he was like, if I stick it up to here, then the specimen will fail around here, so maybe for some specimens I'll stick it to here, some specimens I'll stick it to here. But actually, when we look back at his data, and what we think we'll find when we go through the process of reanalyzing it, which is what I've just started to do in the last couple of weeks, that it didn't matter where he stuck the pole up to. If he just used it to hold the very, very bottom of the spine, where our shoulders would be, where it's kind of quite stiff and rigid anyway, then it would have dislocated in the same spot regardless. It's actually that buckling effect and that compressive force which causes the injury to happen. But that kind of, I think those flaws in his methodology kind of turned people away for 50 years, nearly 40 odd years. So, but now we're just starting to put the pieces together.
Has he since he reached out and gave you all this stuff to look at, has he has he sort of hung around as far as being sort of a resource for you and your collective to sort of, get any sort of context or sort of little pieces of tidbits of information along the way? Or is he sort of just sort of, sort of swept in, dropped this knowledge bomb and went off into the darkness?
He did for a couple of weeks. So he came to the lab. He gave me his materials, and then he came to. So the way he found me was that they send out these emails, and he's been retired for 20 plus years. He'd be over 80, I think. And they send out these bulletins every week about the presentations that are happening at the hospital, and you have to like go into the attachments and open them or whatever. And he's obviously been doing that for like, at least 10, 20 years or something like that. But he said to me that was the first one of those things he'd attended in like over 20 years. Wow. And everyone who was there was like, oh my God, that's Bob Ball. Like people were getting photos with this guy. Oh, really? I'm not even kidding. People were getting photos with this guy. Like he was just a super well renowned and very highly regarded local orthopedic surgeon. He'd started like some of the first ever fellowship programs to send surgeons overseas for fellowships and all that kind of thing. So he's a pretty, it turns out I didn't know any of this obviously, but turns out he's a pretty big name. But he came to the lab, gave me all those materials, came to a presentation. I think he came and visited the lab a second time, and we had a chat. And then he basically just sent me an email and said, "Brian, really impressed with all your knowledge and the work you're doing. Hope my materials can be of use. All I want is for you to create a movie from one of the cineradiograph films." So he wants me to kind of digitize those rolls of films of the radiographs and create a film of what happened during his experiments, because obviously that was very difficult to do back then. And that's exactly what we want to do, because we want to look at how the bones were moving when he was doing what he was doing. But I actually emailed him only a couple of weeks ago saying, just checking in, hope you haven't died from coronavirus. And just wanted to let you know that we've got all this stuff in the works, and we'll send you through that video that you wanted as soon as we can. So
wow, oh, that's incredible. I mean, so I guess where you're at, and this is obviously just even looking at his journey and the amount of time that's passed over the decades. It's incredible for a simpleton on the outside looking in, just to think of, wow, like, we're still trying to work out the body. We're still trying to work out how all this shit works. Like there's so much mystery still attached to basically what we're, like, I'm just looking at myself, like, flailing around and moving my arms around as I'm trying to describe or try and get some awareness of what's going on. But, it's incredible that we're still trying to work all this stuff out. But I guess, with all this research that you're doing, I mean, do you sort of have a thought or a theory as far as what this will lead to, as far as what kind of impact it will have? I mean, obviously, it will then benefit, I guess, what recovery, or surely it can't be prevention, because if you're in an accident, you're in an accident. I mean, you can't reinforce these parts of your body to ensure that you don't have these dislocations. But it must be something about recovery that's probably where the focus is.
Well, it's a hard one, because we're especially my area, we're at such a fundamental part of the process. So the way we kind of spin it, or the way we sell it, is that what we're doing, we're trying to use to inform the devices that inform the prevention devices. So, for example, crash test dummies. They have maybe a force transducer at the top of the skull, the top of the neck, at the base of the skull, and then they have a neck that's represented by one solid link that's then fixed to the torso, and they use those forces to try and figure out whether this airbag's working well. Well, we know that from our research that these injuries that we study, they occur at much, much, much lower forces than you would think would cause a spinal cord injury, based on other types of injuries that can happen. So we need a more what we call biofidelic or more physiological or truly representative neck with more sensors to be able to better represent the human condition during these traumatic scenarios. So that's that's the little bit, and there's such limited research into that kind of thing. There's the latest crash test dummies still only have the neck represented by a couple of links and are just a force transducer at the top and the bottom. So we're trying to, I guess, work our way into that kind of thing. Like, let's better represent the human body when we're testing things that could potentially lead to these kind of injuries. There's been all that well-publicized stuff about airbags and how that they can cause injury in situations where there wouldn't have been injury before. One of the things, I went over to the States a couple of years ago, and I was at the NHTSA, the National Highway and Transport Safety Authority, or whatever it is, basically the big governing body for cars and manufacturing in the States, in Ohio. And one of the things they were saying is that they'll design new tests, and then there's teams of engineers at automotive companies that their job is to try and figure out how they can get their car to pass the test. Not how they can get their car to be safer, how they can get it to pass the test. So it may be less stiff or stiffer in particular areas so that it passes the test, but in other areas it completely invalidates what they're trying to achieve with these tests. So the only way you can kind of assess whether those things are important or not to saving lives is to have better models of the human body.
Yeah, I didn't even think about it like that. I mean, I guess it's getting in front of the prevention. Like, it's not even about the body itself. It's about everything that comes in contact with the body, and making sure that you're mitigating those scenarios, rather than how it's not for me saying reinforcing the body. It's like, it's about putting the body, like everything around it. It's all those scenarios that the body experiences. So
yeah, I mean like the other prong to it that you mentioned, the whole treatment and all that kind of thing, that is a big part of it as well. And that was kind of the motivation behind the audit that I did for the first part of my study. And we've got lots of, not myself specifically, but other people in our group have lots of clinical trials currently going on with drugs that we can use to try and prevent swelling in the spinal cord, which causes these sequelae of spinal cord injury, secondary neurological effects and all that from edema of the cord and that kind of thing. So there's all these other areas. You can't prevent some drunken idiot from diving off of the Port Elliot jetty when it's low tide. Someone's going to do that, and someone's going to give themselves a neck injury. But if we can stop particular parts of particular design criteria of cars from being at high risk of causing these types of injuries, and actually divert them so in fact you just get a broken arm or a collapsed lung instead of a spinal cord injury, then that's what we're trying to work towards.
Just as you're describing all this, I'm sitting here in my chair and I'm moving my neck around, and I'm just, every time I feel like a little creak, I'm like, oh fuck, oh jeez. I'm just like hyper aware of everything that's going on in my body at the moment.
Well, I'm very biased, but the neck is just like, it's crazy. I mean, the head is probably the most important part of our body. It's what makes us really live. But the neck is what supports that, and the neck is what transports everything that we're seeing and perceiving and feeling and thinking and doing to the rest of our body. And likewise, everything that comes from the rest of our body up to our head is what allows us to do that. And the neck has to be so resilient and so strong, but also have so much flexibility and motion to allow us to just, look at 270 degrees laterally around us, and allow us to take in our surroundings and be aware of danger and all those kind of things. And it's an extremely challenging thing to research because of that reason. It's so flexible but so strong.
I mean, what goes through your head when you're seeing people doing windmills on stage or whatever? Like, just like looking at it, going, "Oh, like, are we doing damage here?"
Actually, there's a funny story about that as well. There was a group in University of New South Wales, I'm pretty sure, or somewhere in New South Wales, and they did a study on the effects of headbanging and whether it can affect your brain. And their conclusion was that anyone who headbangs is going to give themselves brain damage in the long term. And so they published this result, but they used the wrong equations. Like, they completely fucked it up. And obviously, like, it doesn't give you brain damage. Like, it's not good for you, probably, if you do it too regularly and too vigorously, just like anything you do. But they published this study saying headbanging was going to lead to brain damage, but it was completely bogus. And I don't think that's even been retracted. I think that's still a published article.
Oh, well, I would have fucking believed that. I mean, I know guys that just, will not stop headbanging from the moment the doors open until the end of the night, and they're pretty close to being brain dead themselves. I know a few people.
Is that correlation or causation though? That's
yeah, very true. Good point. Good point.
Nah, you love those people. They're good people.
Oh, look, mate, they pay to get in. They're the people that buy the tickets in advance.
Yeah, and the merch. They buy all the merch.
Yeah, straight away. They don't wait for the discounts. They're first day buyers. you got to support them. Man, dude, like incredible stuff. I mean, I know you've been doing it for a while, and it's it's part of your life, and obviously I'm sure you've got enough awareness to understand that what you're doing is pretty incredible. But I think especially for anybody that has a stereotypical everyday sort of job or everyday existence, sort of understanding some of the stuff that you do is pretty incredible. So it's cool, and I think also just and I've done this quite a bit with other people who've been on the podcast, especially a lot of musos. Like, I think people sort of give musos a bit of a bad rap because you throw your stereotypes against a lot of us, where we live for the music, and especially appearance wise, and all the stereotypes you can chuck against a stereotypical metalhead or whatever. And a lot of us get up to some really cool stuff, and we've got some really great stories, and we're just totally invested in more than just music and stuff like that, which is still a massive part of our lives. So it's mad that you do what you do. It's cool, and not just because it's got a shock factor, but it's obviously got a really important purpose as well.
Yeah, I do think, especially metalheads, obviously get a bad rap. But like I said before, I did a lot of sport as a kid, and I think metalheads get a very bad rap, because I'd put even just the general population, and even people I work with, or my colleagues and stuff like that. Some musicians might not be book smart or whatever you want to call it in terms of how you label intelligence, but you'd put them up, one for one with a lot of my mates, and a lot of general people I know in the music industry, and they're just as smart. It's just a different type of intelligence, and people, they just get a bad rap. There's a lot of good people doing a lot of good things in music outside of just their music. So,
I think everyone's got different strengths in different areas, and I know a lot of people that have sort of worked in fields, at least from my point of view, and sort of when I size myself up against somebody else, I go, oh fuck, man, like you've done some incredible things, but then I see them in a particular social setting or a setting that I've got some comfort in, and you watch them crumble because their skill set and their strength is in a different area, and I think it's a really assuring thing for a lot of us out there that sort of go, what, we're all pretty good at different things, and that's what makes the world go around, really. I mean, you need that variance and that balance, and not everybody can be doing the same thing. So, but I mean, it's cool to see some real sort of challenges to the stereotypes out there. It's awesome.
Yeah, I agree.
Alrighty, go and support Ryan and the boys in Shatterbrain by checking out their new album, Pitchfork Justice, which is out now. You can go to shatterbrainmetal.com and go go and pick up a copy of their new album. It's on all the streaming platforms, of course, and Shatterbrain's on all the socials, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, blah, blah, blah. And I'll put links to that and all the bands that Ryan's involved with, as well as the things that we spoke about in this episode as well. I'll dump a whole bunch of links in the show notes over at andysocial.net or andydowling.net, and you can check it all out. As always, with all the guests on the podcast, go and reach out to these guys and gals and leave a little message, leave a comment on the socials, or flick them an email or a message or whatever it is, and let them know that you heard them on the podcast and hopefully you enjoyed it. And spread the love. I think everyone would get a kick getting a message or a comment from somebody that's listened to them on the Andy Social. So make sure you do that. I'm no doubt they'll be stoked. Now, before we wrap it up, as mentioned at the beginning of these podcasts, I'm on Patreon. Patreon has been incredibly rewarding for me, just to even have this collective of legends that have been supporting me with the podcast. And already the impact of Patreon has been massive in curbing, whatever. It's doing great things when it comes to the costs of this podcast. So from a financial point of view, it's been fantastic. It's covering all my editing costs at the moment. So that's taken a bit of the financial burden off me. But more importantly, it's motivating me to continue to smash through Antisocial and put out more of these great episodes, and also work on a lot of other different things. So my Patreon community is aware of some of the little ideas that are bouncing around in my noggin and that I'm working on at the moment. So if you're interested in backing what I do and being a part of some of this other stuff, and just listening in and just getting a taste, or a little bit more of a taste of my world, then go over to patreon.com/AndyDowling. If I can even say my name properly. If you just want to support with nothing in return, there's a little dollar tier, which is nice and easy. But there's a $5 and a $10 tier as well, which gives you access to different things. And there's a Patreon exclusive podcast there where you get to hear me waffle on and do a whole bunch of different things, which I really enjoy doing. So it's been a massive help, and I'm hoping to continue to build that little community there, and it's been fantastic. So go over there, check it out, and support what I do if you can. And a little shout out to my social circle tier supporters. These guys are the majority as far as supporting the podcast when it comes from a financial point of view, which is absolutely incredible, and they are just absolute champions with backing me, supporting me. So it's just incredibly cool. So these guys deserve a shout out. Andrew from Perth, Mick G from Sydney, Ash from Deniliquin, Dan from Dapto, Rod from Rayleigh in North Carolina, I should say, Saul from Oxford in the UK, Patrick from Canberra, Liam from Brisbane, and Chris from Sydney. Thank you very much, folks. Absolute legends. Means a hell of a lot. You guys know the drill. And that's it, folks. If you're not interested in Patreon, or you can't at this point in time, you can still support this podcast by simply listening to it. So if you're listening to me right now, you're supporting. So that means a hell of a lot. So thank you very much. And as always, ratings, reviews, a bit of social media love. You can join the private social Facebook group as well. So you can search for the Andy Social on Facebook groups and you'll probably find it. You can set a little request through and I'll accept it. And there's lots of little interesting things in there and some goodies and giveaways and stuff like that as well. So there's lots of things out there, but lots of ways to support the podcast. But the fact that you're listening to it right now means a hell of a lot. So that's it. Until next week, folks, another episode coming your way very soon. Until then, take care. Ta-da. Bye-bye.
Larry.